Thank you for joining us for the Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program. Learn how to win the battle against pests. Before I just start discussing pest management of our homes and gardens, I want to tell you a bit about the Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program. This program, is a cooperative effort between the University of California and the County of San Diego Watershed Protection Program to bring information to San Diego County residents about how we can reduce the use of pesticides and excess fertilizers that contaminate our watersheds. While at the same time, the program provides us with information about how to manage some of the most common pests of our homes and gardens that interfere with our ability to grow healthy, productive plants. To illustrate how easily these contaminating materials like pesticides and excess fertilizers enter into our watershed, I want to show you a brief video illustrating San Diego watersheds in particular, and then we'll talk about alternative methods for managing these pests of our homes and gardens. This video is about 3 minutes.
Have you ever been walking along a quiet beach without a soul in sight and suddenly stumbled across a pile of trash? You've probably asked yourself, where did all this garbage come from? There's hardly anyone here. The truth is, it may have traveled a further distance to get to the beach than you did from your home. You see, when water moves downstream, it carries with it things you can see, like plastic bags and cigarette butts. It also carries things you can't see, like pesticides and fertilizers. Even though it's not as obvious as the trash, pesticides and fertilizers that get in the water can hurt the small animals and plants that live there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how these pollutants got to the beach, we need to know a little more about a thing we call a watershed. What is a watershed? Well, basically, a watershed is a geographic area that drains to a common water body, but it's so much more. Each watershed includes an ever-changing system of water bodies, such as streams, creeks, drinking water reservoirs, lakes, estuaries, bays, and in most of the watersheds in San Diego County, the Pacific Ocean. In San Diego County, we have 11 watersheds that drain west towards the Pacific Ocean. The waterways in these watersheds provide San Diego County residents with water for a multitude of uses, including our water supply for drinking and industry, irrigation for landscape and agriculture, support for wildlife and estuarine habitats, and recreational activities. Remember the trash on the beach? It was probably carried there through the streams and storm drain systems within the watershed. Ultimately, trash, pesticides, fertilizers, and even soil from erosion will reach our beaches, causing an unsightly and toxic mess for residents and wildlife. So wait, let's look at that again. The water in the ocean comes from the streams and creeks, and the streams and creeks pick up runoff from the land further upstream. So that means if I spray pesticides on my lawn in Lakeside, use too much fertilizer on my tomatoes in Fallbrook, or throw a bottle on the ground in Bonita, these materials can run off my property, flow down my street, enter into a storm drain or stream system, and then end up in the ocean. Remember, if you spray something in your garden or on your landscape, there's a good chance it could end up at the beach. So what happens if this waste and pollution ends up on the beach? Trash on the beach can not only dampen our fun, wildlife can become entangled in it or swallow it. Even though fertilizers and pesticides are not as visible as trash, they also have a big impact on the health of the watershed. With more than 3 million people in San Diego County, can you imagine the amount of waste and other pollution going down our watersheds? You get the picture, and it's not a pretty one. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like the day at the beach that I'm looking forward to this weekend. So what can you do to help? Put trash in a trash can. Reduce your use of pesticides and fertilizers around your home and garden. Whenever possible, use non-toxic or less toxic methods to solve your pest problems. Also, watch your irrigation system and adjust it to reduce runoff. This can help reduce water pollution from pesticides, fertilizers, and soil erosion. By taking a few simple steps, you can have an enormous impact on improving and protecting the health of our watersheds. Remember, it's the water that connects us. For more information on how you can make a difference in protecting your watersheds, contact the San Diego County Watershed Protection Program at 858-846-0800 or visit our website at www.projectcleanwater.org.
All right, thank you for your attention to that video. And I want to point out that because the majority of these contaminating materials come from residential properties in San Diego County, this is an important message for us. But there is a solution. The solution to those contaminating materials entering into our watershed is integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is a least hazardous strategy that combines several methods for controlling pests and maintaining healthy gardens rather than relying on only one method. And I want to, in addition to reducing watershed contamination, using less pesticides also reduces the chance for our non-target organisms in our homes and gardens to come in contact with pesticide residues, or for those pesticides to cause damage to our homes and gardens in other ways, including damaging beneficial insects, which I'll talk about more later in the presentation. Finally, oftentimes using pesticides often exacerbates the pest problem. So if we can reduce the use of these contaminating materials, we can often get better management of our pests in the home and gardens. Because it's unrealistic and impractical to attempt to eliminate plant pests from an outdoor environment, using pesticides often cause more harm than good. So integrated pest management works because it's scientifically based on the interaction of organisms in the environment. In other words, if we understand the way a pest feeds on a plant, the way the pest reproduces, the way the pest prefers a specific environment, and how these pests and organisms interact with one another, we can better apply management strategies that are more effective for the long term. We can apply management strategies that are specific to the pests we're trying to manage. This will save us time and money. Everyone knows pesticides are expensive and difficult to use, but integrated pest management often reduces and or even eliminates the need for pesticides altogether. Keeping in mind that we're using several methods for managing pests in combination with one another. I want to point out here that IPM does not necessarily mandate that we cannot use pesticides ever, but again, we want to use the least toxic material that will be effective on the pest and use it only as necessary when all other methods have been attempted. The key strategy or method in integrated pest management is prevention. If we can prevent the pest to begin with, then of course there would never be any need for a pesticide. So prevention includes selecting healthy plants and choosing appropriate plants. So when we're looking for plants, whether we're buying them in the nursery or growing seedlings at home, we want to select plants that are healthy. So avoid dry plants or plants that are overwatered. And you can tell the difference if a plant is wilting or the leaves are extremely yellow. You might find that the plant is dry, or sometimes even overwatered plants can have yellow leaves. Root-bound plants would have roots, as you see in the picture here, circling around the container that they're growing in. Those plants will never transplant and grow healthy, so we want to avoid those. Look for evidence of existing pests, for example, snails and slugs, when you're picking up the containers at the nursery. Look for the damage like you see here that leaf miner has caused to the leaves on this plant, and look for evidence of chewing damage. You would also choose plants that are appropriate for the location where you want to plant them. So spend some time in the area where you intend to plant these plants and look at how the sun moves across the environment so that you know what the light exposure is in that area. Are there any heat sources that may reflect back onto the plant, like white fencing, for example? What is the soil like? Is it heavy clay or very loose sand or something in between? And how much space do you have to plant these plants? We always want enough space to grow plants to their mature size. And always choose plants that are compatible not only with the location you plan to plant them, but compatible with each other. You're looking for plants that have similar water requirements, light requirements, soil requirements, and nutritional requirements. Prevention can also include choosing pest-resistant plants. Strawberries, for example, some varieties are called short day varieties. They fruit in May and June only. This particular variety called Chandler would be more resistant to certain diseases. Tomatoes labeled with disease identification codes V, F, and or N on the plant label or seed packet would be resistant to certain diseases and nematodes, which I'll talk more about in a while. You can trellis vining plants to reduce their vulnerability to some common pests. For example, trellising squash may reduce the feeding on the plant by cucumber beetle. And always ask your nursery professional for a recommendation if you're looking for a pest-resistant plant for a particular location or use in your garden. Prevention also includes proper preparation and planting. We want to make sure we're controlling the weeds in a particular garden area before planting the plants. This would include hoeing and sometimes soil solarization. Of course, hand pulling is one of our best tools in the garden as well. I'll talk more about soil solarization when I talk about weed control. When you plant, you want to loosen the compacted garden soil and mix well. Make sure you don't pulverize the soil, but don't leave very large clods either. Large cloddy soil will introduce too much air into the root environment and plants won't thrive. Although plants need air around their roots, the air should only come from the very tiny air pockets in the soil, not from large holes or clods. As you plant, any loosened container soils should be mixed well with the native soil. When you're planting trees, plant about 2 inches higher than the soil level. In other words, your root ball should sit up above the soil level about 2 inches to provide good drainage away from the crown and trunk of the plant. Vegetables, on the other hand, can be planted deep enough to bury the stem as far as the first leaf. So your tomatoes and peppers, things like that that have an upright growth, can be planted deeper. This will cause them to establish additional roots on the buried portion of the stem, providing for better water and nutrient uptake, as well as stability as they grow large to maturity. And always water your plants several hours before planting out, and then water thoroughly immediately after planting to settle that soil around the roots, and again, avoid large air pockets that could dry out the sensitive roots directly after transplanting. Make sure to water sufficiently so that water passes all the way past the root zone and deeply into the soil. Prevention also includes the way we care for our plants after planting. Proper cultural care will yield maximum resistance to diseases, tolerance for insect damage, and more vigorous growth. Healthy plants are better able to withstand attack from pest organisms, so that when we remember that we can never eliminate these organisms from our environment, we will always have to tolerate some number of them, but we know our plants will be better able to withstand attack from those organisms when they're growing healthy and productive. Resources that I find very useful for learning about proper cultural practices for all kinds of different plants of the home and garden, but particularly your food producing plants, would be Pests of the Garden and Small Farm and California Master Gardener Handbook. There are other handy and awesome publications that you can find on the University of California Integrated Pest Management website. You'll get a link to this website at the end of the presentation, but you'll find other handy things like vineyard pest identification cards and all kinds of things, all of them with great color photos to help you identify pests, as well as learn how to properly care for the plants in your garden. Now, integrated pest management, as I said, requires that we use several methods in combination with one another, leaving pesticides as a last resort. We're going to start with pest identification, and you'll remember I said that integrated pest management works because it's based on the biology of the organisms we're working with. Again, if we understand how the organism feeds or what its growth habit is, how many seeds it produces, when, and all of those things, we can better manage those pests in our homes and gardens. So identification of the pest is key to learning about its biology and how it behaves in the garden environment. This will then allow us to apply the appropriate control measures that would be more effective for the long term, specific to the organisms we're trying to manage. I mentioned earlier I would talk about beneficial insects. We call these beneficial insects natural enemies. We want to encourage these natural enemies that will feed on the insect pests that may be attacking our plants, thereby helping us to manage the population of the pest organisms. And again, as a last resort, in combination with our other IPM methods, we would use reduced risk pesticides when necessary and apply them properly by reading the label thoroughly and understanding the product and proper application. And I'll talk more about that as well. So today we're going to look at 4 broad categories of plant pests and how to manage them. First, we'll look at insects and mites. Insects are 6-legged organisms. Mites are members of the arachnid order. So they are like spiders. They have 8 legs. These organisms are either sucking or chewing. In other words, their mouth parts are used to either suck plant sap from the plant leaves or to chew the plant parts themselves, consuming the plant. We'll talk about the sap-sucking insects producing a honeydew excrement and how that impacts our management efforts, and then look at the chewed plant parts so that we can tell the difference between these types of organisms. We'll look at snails and slugs. They do chew plant parts, but we'll want to differentiate between them and other chewing insects. We'll look at diseases and nematodes that affect both foliar and root portions of the plant. And then we'll look at weeds. And weeds are considered a plant pest because they compete for space, water, nutrients, and light. And they also harbor pests and diseases that then may move into our desirable garden plants. I want you to notice here that the first three categories have been marked with an asterisk. That's because these categories all include natural enemies that we want to preserve and encourage in our home and garden environment to help us manage the pest problems. Starting with the insect pests, we'll look at aphids. Aphids are soft-bodied insects that have sucking mouth parts. You'll notice here that the winged adults look a bit different than all the other members of this group, but you often only see the winged adults when the population has become so dense that this winged female is going to fly to another location on the plant or another plant altogether and start a new population of aphids. Aphids are identified by these little tiny tailpipes that stick out from their posterior end. These tailpipes are called cornicles, and most aphid species have them, although aphids may be different in color. A peach aphid or a black aphid or a green aphid, for example, they all have the same life cycle and feeding habits. So what we want to be aware of is that they give live birth. They do not lay eggs. So these little tiny members of the population that you see here are the newborns, and the larger ones are the reproducing females. Aphids will congregate in high numbers, very dense numbers, on the growing tips of plants, on the undersides of leaves, and they produce a honeydew-like excrement. The excrement is the sugary material that the aphids have sucked out of the plant cells, but they don't retain the sugary excrement. They only retain amino acids and proteins that they've removed from the plant cell, but they excrete the sugary sap and drop it onto the plant. So it's a sweet dew-like drop that's excreted from the aphid, and it sticks to the surface of the plant, of the surface of the leaves or the stems, and thereby attracts ants and a sooty mold spore. So you see on the bottom left, the picture labeled sooty mold is a black sooty-like fungal material that's covering the leaves of this plant. Excuse me. This sooty mold, it is a fungus. The spores float around in the environment, and when they land in the sticky honeydew, they use that honeydew as a food source to proliferate the mold. The mold does not actually infect the tissues of the plant, but if it gets thick enough or proliferates enough, it will reduce photosynthesis by covering over the surface of the leaves. But this is also an indication that you have a sap-sucking insect in populations high enough that they're dropping enough honeydew that's causing the growth of the sooty mold. So you'll want to inspect your plants when you see sooty mold of this nature. Sap-sucking insects can also attract ants by the production of honeydew, because the ants use the honeydew as a food source. The ants will also fight off those natural enemies that come to feed on the pest. So for example, lady beetles feed on aphids. But if ants are present because they're feeding on the honeydew being excreted by the aphids, then the lady beetles will be attacked by the ants, and she won't be able to come and help us control the aphids by feeding on them. So we also need to manage the ants that might be crawling on the plants, looking or feeding on the honeydew. So you'll want to manage the ants as well as manage the sap-sucking pests. Sap-sucking insects also can cause damage to our plants by feeding on the cells as the cells are very young and just beginning to develop and mature. And this can cause something called epinasty that you see here. It's the curling and distortion of the new growth. Many sap-sucking insects feed on the new succulent, weaker growth, on our plants, and the epinasty could be a result of that. So if you see this, you also know that you have sap-sucking insects feeding on your plants that you should try to get under management. And then aphids may also transmit plant virus diseases from one plant to another by feeding on an infected plant and then moving to a non-infected plant. They can transfer that virus. In the home and garden environment, that's typically not a major issue. But if you see some unusual variegation in your plants that you've never seen before, you may also then inspect the plant looking for signs of sap-sucking insects. Whitefly is another sap-sucking insect that you may be familiar with. They are tiny little moth-like insects with yellow bodies and white wings. They are typically found on the underside of the plant leaves. They also produce honeydew and can cause a proliferation, therefore, of the sooty mold, as you see in the top plant on the top left. The nymphs that you see on the top right are mature nymphs of a citrus whitefly. Whiteflies do produce eggs. They lay eggs. The eggs then morph into these nymph stages. And you can see that most often the nymphs are oval in shape. Some of them may have filament type growth growing off the sides all around the circumference of the nymph, and some of them may not. It depends on the whitefly species. But you can see here that we have some natural enemies or little tiny wasps that come and parasitize whitefly nymphs by laying their eggs inside the nymph casing or the nymph body. And you can see in the bottom left picture, these giant whitefly nymphs or pupal stages have turned dark black because they've been parasitized by a tiny little wasp. This little wasp lays its egg again in the nymph or in the pupal casing, and the new generation of wasp grows up inside the whitefly nymph, feeding on the whitefly until the wasp then is ready to cut an exit hole from the inside of the pupal casing and then emerge from the dead whitefly casing. So if you see these perfectly round little exit holes in the whitefly casing, you know that you have a parasitic wasp that is helping you to manage your whitefly population. Oh, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. Let's go back. So other management efforts that we can apply for aphids and whitefly, in addition to encouraging those natural enemies, is before planting, check surrounding areas for sources of aphids like weeds and remove them. Aphids, again, build up on weeds and move into our crops after our crop seedlings emerge or after we've planted new plants. The aphids and whitefly will move into our new crop plants. So look for sources of them and remove them. Grow your homegrown seedlings under protective covers until you're ready to plant them out in the garden. Prune out or pinch leaves with large populations of either whitefly or aphids. Be careful not to remove too many leaves from the plant because you can reduce photosynthesis, but don't hesitate to remove the most infested leaves or branches. To keep ants out of the plant where you have sap-sucking insects that you're trying to manage, you can use a band of sticky material around the trunk of the tree. You always want to protect the trunk of the tree with a band of material that you then apply the sticky material to. You can find this sticky material in most garden centers. and it's used to help keep the ants out of the tree while you're managing the sap-sucking insects. But you also want to apply other management methods for ants. So please refer to our Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program on ants as well. Another control for aphid, whitefly, and all other sap-sucking insects is to never use more nitrogen fertilizer than necessary. Not only will you potentially contaminate the watersheds, but you will also produce excessive weak succulent growth that is very attractive and easy for these aphids and whitefly to feed on. So only use as much fertilizer as necessary. By learning about your plants, when to fertilize and with how much, and preferably use a slow release fertilizer rather than a quick release or a water soluble fertilizer. You can also knock these insects off, aphids and whitefly, with a strong spray of water from the end of your garden hose. I want to also make you aware that there are some pests that can cause issues for our agricultural growers in the San Diego area by the nature of their feeding habits, their flying habits, and their disease carrying habits. So for example, you may have heard of the Asian citrusillid, or ACP. This is a sap-sucking insect that feeds on citrus. If this insect feeds on a tree infected with citrus greening disease, or HLB, then this disease can then be moved to a healthy tree by the feeding of the insect. And so we don't want this disease to spread into our agricultural areas or our backyard citrus trees. So please be on the lookout for this little teeny tiny sap-sucking insect. You can learn more about it on the University of California website or the CDFA website. But if you think you may have found it in your citrus trees at home, please do call the CDFA hotline, and someone will come out and look at your trees for proper identification. Another bug that can be an issue in home gardens and organic agriculture is called the Bagrata bug. This is a little harlequin bug that you may have seen bugs that look very similar to it. And this is why pest identification is important. You notice here that the young nymphal stages of the adult that's shown on the right, these young nymphs on the left could be mistaken for lady beetles just based on their size and coloring. So I want to point these out as not only being a potential pest, but also how important correct identification is, so that we apply management efforts to the Bagrata bug, but we don't disturb lady beetles, for example. So check your plants regularly. These insects are often found feeding on members of the Brassica family, cauliflower, broccoli, and things like that. And they are frequent where little or no pesticide are used. So if you need to manage them, you can knock them into a bucket of soapy water, and you can gently till the soil around the base of the plant, because that's where they lay their eggs. And so you can keep their numbers down by managing them that way. But any other issues or difficulty managing them, please do look at the UC IPM website for more information. All right, spider mites. These are little teeny tiny spider-like organisms that feed on plants. So they don't necessarily bother humans, but they are a sort of sap-sucking insect, but they don't produce honeydew. But they can do some severe damage to your plants, including this severe mottling, webbing, and leaf drop. They are most numerous in June through September when temperatures are warm and the dust tends to be higher on our plants. So if you notice that your garden environment is getting very dusty, then you may want to wash your plants off a couple of times during this time of the year. But also keep in mind that these spider mites are often found in conjunction with, also found in conjunction with natural enemies or other spider mites that feed on the pest mites. So I'll talk about that. Spider mite populations can become very high if they're not managed properly. Damage is usually worse when your plants are water stressed, so make sure your plants are being well cared for, as we talked about previously, to make them better able to withstand attack from a spider mite invasion. And avoid using pesticides or miticides because, again, the natural enemy mites that exist in with the population of the pest mite will be killed, and then your pest mite population will explode because the natural enemy mites or the beneficial mites cannot repopulate as quickly and as easily as the pest mites do. So whenever you're looking at your plants, you're going to want to look at them very closely. I'm showing you a picture here of a person using a hand lens or a loop to examine the leaves of the plant very closely. You're going to want some kind of magnifying lens. Most of the organisms I've discussed already are small, very tiny in some cases, and you're going to want to get a good look at them for proper identification. So always have a magnifying lens handy when you go out to your garden at least once a week and look at the entirety of your plant, under the leaves, the growing tips, and so on. Insect pests include caterpillars and grasshoppers that have chewing mouth parts. So of course, you're going to see the damage they do quite readily because they're eating the leaves of your plant. So keep a lookout. Now you know that these organisms blend in quite well to the plants that they're feeding on. So you're going to have to look closely for them as well. We have here a cabbage looper, a mature hornworm larva that you often see feeding on tomatoes, and a speckled green fruitworm larva. So these caterpillars are the larva of, as you know, a moth or a butterfly, but the larva stage is the damaging stage. So look for their egg masses on the underside of the leaves and destroy them whenever you see them. And remove the caterpillars by hand whenever possible, disposing of them in a trash receptacle. And then, of course, the grasshoppers. Now, grasshoppers are difficult to catch, difficult to hand pick, but it's even more difficult to control them with pesticides because the pesticide must either be consumed by the grasshopper or come in contact with the grasshopper. You're taking a chance on applying a pesticide that the grasshopper is going to visit that plant, or that when you apply the pesticide, the grasshopper will stay still in order for you to apply the material on top of it. So using pesticides for grasshopper control is not effective. We're going to want to use other methods that I'll talk about briefly. Snails and slugs, again, also have chewing mouth parts, but you can tell the difference between these chewing pests and the caterpillars and the grasshoppers because the snails and slugs leave behind their slime trails. Even when they're dried up, sometimes you can see them by looking at the leaves at different angles or light exposures. You can see the slime trails. But they also chew irregular holes with smooth edges in leaves and flowers, and they can clip succulent plant parts and seedlings. They can also chew fruit and young plant bark. So if you have all of these things in your garden being eaten, then you know you have snails and slugs. But you'll notice too that caterpillars, and grasshoppers, they tend to eat from the outer edges of the leaf inward, or they will leave behind the veins of the leaf and only eat the green tissue of the leaf. Whereas snails and slugs most often will eat from the middle of the leaf, and again they use or they leave behind these irregular holes with smooth edges, or if they're chewing from the edge of the leaf, the edges are very smooth and not jagged like a caterpillar or grasshopper would leave behind. So how do we control these chewing plant pests? Well, as I said, when it comes to caterpillars, you can hand pick or clip and dispose of infested foliage and flowers. So if you see lots of little caterpillars, by all means, you can just clip off that leaf and throw that away. Microbial pesticides like Bacillus thuringiensis or BT are safer for the environment as well as for natural enemies. So if you would like to give that product a try, it's very effective on the caterpillars. Grasshoppers, again, hand pick when you can and squash them, but you can also divert them from the garden by using a green border. Plant something on the border of your garden that the grasshoppers prefer to eat, and you can look that up again on the IPM website. To determine what you might plant around the edges of the garden to attract the grasshoppers to those plants where you can then try to get better management of them. And again, the insecticides are not very effective, and some of the pesticides used for control of grasshoppers is also very toxic and leaves behind a long-term residue in your garden environment. It can also be washed into the storm drain system with irrigation and rain. Snails and slugs, the best thing you can do is trap them. Baits are not effective, especially when used by themselves, because the organism has to come in contact with the bait or consume the bait and then not be rehydrated within a certain period of time. So what happens is the bait is supposed to act as a desiccant on the organism, but snails and slugs like to congregate in moist, dark places. So it's very easy for them to become rehydrated. And oftentimes most of your bait ends up getting washed away or, moved around in the garden rather than being effective. So trap your snails and slugs by using copper strips. They really do work, as you see here in this photo. Or you can make your own traps out of wood or hollowed out cantaloupe or watermelon rind turned upside down in the garden. As long as there is a moist, dark place for the snail and slugs to get underneath when they're moving into the dark, moist place in the morning as the sun is coming up, then you'll be able to go out and collect them and dispose of them. So any contraption that you want to use to trap them, as long as it's dark and moist, you'll be sure to find them there. Also go out into your yard and look for them in those places like in ice plant or grassy areas, hiding underneath your garden plants where it's dark and moist most of the time. Collect them and dispose of them. Moving on to plant diseases, we're looking at fusarium and verticillium wilt diseases. These are diseases that infect the water and nutrient carrying tissues in the center of the stems of the plants. They attack mainly herbaceous plants like tomatoes and peppers, those food producing plants in our gardens. And if you've ever had this disease, it's not real common, it can occur, but what you would notice is that wilt symptoms appear first on one side of the plant. And that's because you can have a healthy stem right next to an infected stem. The healthy stem will continue to deliver water and nutrients to the plant as required, while the infected stem cannot function properly. And so the plant will begin to show yellowing leaves and wilting. What's the first thing we do when we see a yellowing, wilting plant is we water it. But these diseases are soil-borne disease, and they tend to become a problem when our soil moisture is not managed properly, typically when we're overwatering and we don't have good drainage. So if we water when we see a wilting plant, we're typically exacerbating the problem. So remember to always check soil moisture before you apply water to your plants. To manage fusarium and verticillium, avoid overwatering and provide good drainage, as I mentioned, and avoid applying excess fertilizer. Excessive fertilizer acts as a desiccating agent because fertilizers are salts. Excess fertilizer around the roots of our plants will dry out the roots, thereby causing the roots to become weak and more susceptible to infestation by the disease pathogen. So again, proper fertilizing and watering properly, taking good care of our plants goes a long way to helping us manage any of these disease situations that might occur. Powdery mildew is a foliar disease. This fungal disease will be found on the surface of the leaves of the plant. And the powdery mildew affects many different plants in our garden. So using resistant plant varieties is a good management method. You can use fungicide treatments like oils or sulfurs, excuse me, but make sure that you're using them properly by reading the label. Some of these treatments need to be applied before infection and some can be applied after. So make sure you know what your product is and how it's supposed to work by reading the label carefully, and only apply it as necessary. Not to every plant in your garden, but only those most susceptible, for example. This disease thrives in moderate temperatures between 60 to 80 degrees and in the shade. So if your plant is, for example, strawberry or squash, these plants require full sun of 6 to 8 hours each day. If these plants are getting too much shade, either in the morning, afternoon, or anytime in between, they're also susceptible to this disease, so you can be assured that the plants will be infected. So again, putting your plants in the proper location for their growth requirements is extremely important to helping us prevent and manage plant disease. Managing powdery mildew can be done with a combination of methods, just like all of our other pests. What we want to do is prune the plant canopy. For example, your tomatoes can be pruned, especially if you're growing them in cages, to open up the center of the plant for good air circulation. So we not only want good air circulation around the plant or the yard itself, but we want good air circulation throughout the plants or the center of the plant. So prune to raise the canopy, eliminate tangled branches, and permit more air and light to penetrate the interior canopy of the plant. You can also use sprinkler irrigation to manage powdery mildew, but the other diseases that can attack our plants of the garden can be spread by splashing water or sprinkler irrigation. So be very careful about using water to control powdery mildew. Another product that you might want to look into is Bacillus subtilis. This is a biological fungicide that is commercially available. This is a product formulated from beneficial microorganisms that, when sprayed on the plant, inhibits or destroys the fungal pathogens. Nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic roundworms that live in the soil. but they're grouped in with plant diseases because they cause disease-like symptoms because of the fact that they attack the roots of plants. They interfere with the uptake of water and nutrients like some of our soil-borne diseases do. So nematodes will attack annual plants by infesting the root system. They usually will cause distinctive swellings or galls on the roots of affected plants like tomatoes, celery, carrots, things like that, beets, and so on. Controlling nematodes is best done by not allowing irrigation water from infested plants to run off and spread around the garden. But the most important management tool you have is crop rotation. So you want to, for example, instead of planting your tomatoes in the same location in your garden every year, you want to rotate with leafy greens, root crops, and then legumes like beans and peas, so that you're not providing a consistent food source for the nematodes by providing them with susceptible plants season after season after season. You can also buy nematode resistant plants by looking for the disease code N on the plant label or the seed packet. And last but not least, weeds. Weeds are plants that are growing where they're not wanted. So any plant can be a weed, but we're looking specifically at those weeds that are very prolific in our gardens and landscapes because they reproduce both by seed and by asexual reproduction, by rooting along the ground as they grow and things of that nature. They will compete for space, water, nutrients, and light. And so we want to manage them so that our plants have the benefit of all of those things. But weeds will also harbor insects and disease. So you can see here in the bottom picture where we've circled the aphids feeding on the sow thistle weed. And those aphids will then move into your desirable plants. So remember, get your weeds under management, remove them from your garden and landscaped areas so that they don't allow for disease and insects to move in to your garden environment. To help manage weeds, you can mulch your garden, whether it's food producing or just ornamental, to a depth of about 3 inches. The rule for mulch is 3 to 4 inches deep and 3 to 4 inches away, meaning that you never put mulch up against the trunk or the stems of your plants because we don't want the moisture holding mulch to hold the moisture up against the bases of our plants where then insect and disease can then take hold in those tissues. The crown or where the stem and the root meet is an area that's susceptible to rot as well as infestation when the mulch is allowed to rest on top of that. So 3 to 4 inches deep, 3 to 4 inches away. Again, weeding by hand or with tools is the best tool we have in our arsenal for winning the battle against weeds, and get them when they're young. Don't allow them to go to seed. 1 year of weed seed results in 10 years of weeds. So don't forget that 10 to 1 ratio. And then deplete perennial weeds like dandelions, for example, by constantly removing new shoot growth. Eventually, that underground structure will run out of energy to produce new shoot. But if you let it continue to grow and photosynthesize, it's just adding energy back to the system. So if you can't get the entire root out, consistently remove the green growth until it stops producing. And I just wanted to point out that mulches can also be landscape cloth or weed cloth, any kind of barrier that helps keep the weeds down. And then you can also put, a mulch, a bark or something, or even gravel on top of that, to help manage the weeds in your garden areas. Now that we've looked at all of our pest identification and management options and measures, I want to take a look at our natural enemies. Again, these are the organisms in the environment that prey on or parasitize our plant pests. These organisms exist in the environment just like the pests do, usually not as in great numbers, however, so sometimes we miss them. But we definitely want to learn to recognize them, to understand they are not pests in the garden, but they are natural enemies that are helping us to keep the population of the pest organisms down to manageable levels. And that is our goal in integrated pest management. It's not to eradicate, but to manage the population numbers so that we have them under manageable levels so that our plants will still thrive and produce, while at the same time, our natural enemies can help us take care of these pest organisms. Resources to help you with identification of natural enemies. Pests of landscape, trees, and shrubs. Yes, believe it or not, there is a book on pest ID, but there's a great section in here on natural enemies. There are the UCIPM pest notes on the UCIPM website, and you see that that web address here, ipm.ucdavis.edu or ipm.ucanr.edu. And then there's a great publication called the Natural Enemies Gallery. That's one of my favorite publications for its awesome color photographs and detailed imagery and descriptions of these natural enemies. So encourage natural enemies by planting a diversity of flowering and non-flowering plants for their habitat. Some of these adult organisms will come in to feed on nectar or pollen in the garden, and then they'll lay their eggs, and those eggs hatch into the larvae, and the larvae are then the ones that feed on the pest organisms. You can reduce dust on plants because the natural enemies tend to prefer a non-dusty environment. And remember, you can also control some of your pest organisms or manage some of your pest organisms by keeping the dust down. If you're going to use a pesticide, use the least toxic material in a selective way. In other words, use a horticultural oil or a plant-based oil that will target the pest, but only use it on the target population. In other words, it won't do any good to spray it around the entire garden, but you can spray it directly on a population of aphids or on this population of mealybug, for example, that you see the ants feeding on. And that way you're reducing population numbers without impacting the natural enemies in the environment. And then, of course, control ants. Now, I've shown a picture here of ant bait station. Ant bait is the best way to manage ants in the garden. Again, go to the UCIPM website or look at the Healthy Garden, Healthy Home presentation on managing ants. But don't allow the ants to fight off the natural enemies. So use the sticky material on the trunks or stems of the plants to keep the ants out. Use ant bait and manage the sap-sucking insects. Remember to wrap something around the trunk of the tree. Do not apply it directly to the trunk or stems of the plant. And here are some natural enemies that you have probably seen in your environment, whether or not you were aware they're natural enemies. These are some of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? They eat most natural enemies. They eat high numbers of them. So the convergent lady beetle on the right and her larva on the left. You can see that their life stages look nothing alike. They go through complete metamorphosis. So they go from egg to larva to pupa to adult. So it's important to learn to recognize all the stages of their development so that you recognize them in your environment. The green lacewing in the bottom right, that's the adult, and her larva is this little alligator-like creature to the left, also feeding on aphids. The green lacewing feeds on many different soft-bodied insects and do an amazing job of helping us to manage the pest insects. Lady beetles in both the adult and the larva stage will eat hundreds of aphids in their relatively short lifetimes. Natural enemies of whitefly. There are many of those, and outbreaks of whitefly typically occur when the natural enemies have been disturbed or destroyed by pesticides or dust buildup. So keep an eye out again for the green lacewing. You can see here the egg, larva, pupa, and adult stages. The Asian lady beetle feeds on whitefly. You can see there's a slight difference in the appearance, but a lady beetle all the same. And then the minute pirate bug is also a natural enemy of whitefly. So if you see these organisms moving in and around the population of whitefly, you know that they're there to help you, and you want to be very careful about applying any kind of pesticide. Again, if you need to use a horticultural or plant-based oil. I mentioned natural enemies of mites. There is the western predatory mite, the red mite, and the green lacewing. So the predatory mites are more active than the pest mites, and they're always found mixed in with the population of pest mites. So again, using a pesticide to control mites is typically going to cause a bigger problem in the long run. So again, reduce dust and allow these natural enemies to do their job. And then natural enemies of caterpillars and grasshoppers includes birds and chickens. The parasites that I mentioned and that you can see here, this little wasp that's laying her eggs on top of the moth egg, or in the moth egg. I can't tell if it'll be on top or in either one, but that wasp egg will then grow inside the caterpillar egg, effectively killing off that caterpillar. You can see here there are parasitized codling moth eggs, black parasitized fruit worm eggs, and so on. So again, the host, the parasite lays its egg either in the host or on the host. So when it comes to caterpillars, usually the host fly or wasp will lay its egg sometimes inside and sometimes outside on the surface of the caterpillar body. But either way, the larva stages hatch and do their job to effectively kill the pest. And then again, the beneficial pathogens like Bacillus thuringiensis are commercially available for caterpillars as well. Natural enemies of snails and slugs. Decolate snails, although they are not very prolific in San Diego County anymore, and they're often not recommended because they can become a pest themselves. If there are no snails and slugs for them to feed on, then they will start feeding on plants. But if you see them, I don't destroy them. Let them do their thing. And then if they do start to feed on your plants, you can start collecting them and disposing of them. But also ducks, chickens, I guess, will feed on snails and slugs. And then rats too, but you don't want to encourage a population of rats just to get your snails and slugs under control. All right. The best control for snails and slugs again is collecting them and disposing of them. You can also disturb the soil gently and frequently to kill any eggs that you might that they might be laying in the soil. All right. So again, encourage those natural enemies, and if you have to use a pesticide, it should be used in combination with these non-chemical methods that we've discussed, because using certain pesticides can be an option for growing a healthy garden, but when other non-chemical methods are used first, pesticides are often not needed. And remember to use the reduced risk pesticides. Use only the narrow range insecticidal soaps or oils like neem oil that minimize the impact on natural enemies and the environment. Use only when plants are not water stressed and when temperatures are below 80 degrees, because these materials are intended to desiccate the plant pest, but they can also desiccate or dry out your plant if used improperly. So don't over apply them. Make sure your plants are well watered and that temperatures are below 80 degrees and that the wind is blowing at 10 degrees or 10 miles per hour or less. So typically in the early morning or late afternoon or evening hours. Avoiding the use of insecticides that kill beneficial organisms is an important aspect of healthy gardening. So we call these broad spectrum materials because they kill everything they come in contact with. They are not selective to only kill bad bugs. They will kill all bugs. So products containing carbaryl, pyrethroids, diazinon, chlorpyrifos, imidacloprid, these are particularly disruptive to natural enemies. And the diazinon and chlorpyrifos are also found in our waterways, having a negative impact on the aquatic organisms and wildlife in our estuarine habitats, not to mention the quality of our water supply. So again, read the pesticide label and look for the active ingredient and choose the least toxic material like azadirachtin, which is found in the neem oil. Our watershed provides our water resources, so let's do what we can to keep these materials out of our watershed and enjoy our municipal and domestic water supply, our recreational and wildlife habitats. By reducing the use of chemicals that pollute our water resources and using IPM instead. I'll remind you that it's the water that connects us. So read your pesticide labels, store your pesticides in a safe manner, and dispose of unused pesticides properly by calling 1-800-CLEANUP, and they will give you a location near you where you can drop off your unused pesticides free of charge for proper disposal. And with that, I will end the presentation at this point. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll view some more of our Healthy Garden, Healthy Home workshops.